Hello, and welcome to DPI Group Seven's analysis of the movie Pan's Labyrinth. To start off, we're going to just go briefly over the psychological impact and do, some back and forth between our cast and talk about what we learned from this very interesting Guillermo del Toro movie. Sierra?
Yes, interesting it certainly was. So there were quite a few themes to pick out from this movie. It took us through the historical event of the Spanish Civil War. And this was the movie was told from the perspective of Ophelia, who was the main character in the movie. She was the stepdaughter of one of the captains who had served over that war, Captain Vidal. And so, our group sort of pre-discussed some of what was the impact or what did they want us to sort of take away from this event, from this movie. And we're also addressing the role that this movie plays in the conveying objective news analysis and historical accounts. So as far as being objective, I definitely think that, the Guillermo del Toro did not give it to us in an objective fashion. I'm interested to hear everybody else's thoughts. But we sort of see Carlos Vidal as the big scary monster. There was actually a scary monster in the movie, which he had a lot of parallels to the actual monster in the movie that we can delve into a little bit later. But maybe that was the realistic perspective, the realistic take of who Vidal was at that time. So perhaps maybe it was. But as far as the obedience theme, I'd like to see what some thoughts are around that, as far as the obedience from the people who were around Vidal, the obedience of Ophelia, from both, what she heard, the task that she was on, as well as the obedience to the people who were supposed to be leading her, like her mother and her new stepfather.
Okay, so I'll go first. So the theme of obedience is kind of like another subsection. I think I think this movie is a particular critique of or form of obedience through fascism. So in regards, and this is important because it revolves around the Spanish Civil War, in which like the guerrilla fighters were fighting against the Franco-fascist regime, partly during the 1940s when fascism took a rise over Europe, as obviously most criticized by Nazi Germany. So in a sense, Vidal kind of acts as like the embodiment of like this fascist regime and how, he is the fascist in this movie, basically. Like you see if you look like at his outfit, it's very like stereotypical, like military fascist-y, like you could place him in any almost like sort of like World War II movie, and like that outfit, that attire, you kind of already know like what like the director is trying to go for. So I think that's the main way it kind of looks for obedience, but also with obedience, the fact that a child is the protagonist of this movie, and child and obedience is often
She's got a big task ahead of her too.
I'm
for
sorry.
both sides.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I was just saying that she was a child, but she also had a big task ahead of her as well.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. But I think that's kind of how this movie, explores obedience through fascism.
Awesome.
And to add on, like the idea of obedience isn't necessarily just centered towards Ophelia, the main character, protagonist. It's also like just throughout every single character almost, just about, because with the mother, she has to be obedient to the captain's wishes. Like as soon as we meet the captain, he tells her, you need to be obedient and sit down in this wheelchair. And it's almost kind of like a alpha male type of environment that he's putting this lady in. And it's not necessarily for her care, it's for his child's care. He doesn't care about the lady. He cares more so about the child. He sees Ophelia's mother as more of an object for her to be bearing children. And it's almost as, it's kind of like a portraying theme that he sees every single character that is involved in his life as well, like the his right hand man. He sees him as someone who is supposed to serve him, do what he's supposed to do, make sure that he is very well accomplished in those things. And when it comes to Mercedes, his servant, his main servant, he's telling her, make sure you're my assistant, you need to do this. And these kind of traits of obedience are portrayed all throughout those characters as well. With Ophelia, there's not much obedience there, which is kind of ironic because she's supposed to be obedient to someone who's her father figure, which she's not. And in fact, her obedience relies on these mythical creatures who are supposed to lead her to her father figure as they tell her and relate to her throughout the movie.
Good point. Really good point. Who was the biggest, I guess, portrayal that you guys think, was it the doctor, or was it Mercedes, or do you think it was someone else, Ophelia even?
I would say that the biggest portrayal is probably the doctor, or because I just think that he was doing pretty, even when he didn't want to, he would do what Mercedes said and what the captain said. Like when he was helping with, you know, the guerrilla warriors and people who were trying to, like, you know, upset the fascist regime, he was listening to Mercedes, even though he was terrified of, you know, getting caught. And then when he would get back to the camp, he would listen to the captain so that he could never be found out. He would do pretty much everything that he was told to do, like bringing his wife, so to speak, to the camp, despite, you know, him knowing that it's dangerous for her to be traveling so late in her pregnancy. And then when the man was asking him to basically spare him and like put his misery to an end, he did that too, knowing that it would get him in trouble. So I think he kind of just listens very often blindly, or, you know, with good intention, but he's a listener, he's a follower.
That's a really good point, Devin, especially about in the beginning. It sort of was a foreshadow with him telling him, like, yeah, she shouldn't have traveled this late in her pregnancy, because as you see, you know, the captain was very much surrounded by yes men. And so to have someone sort of challenge him in that way was sort of a foreshadow for what was to become, or what he found out his true affiliations were. So that's a good point. Especially because he only had one chance. They had pretty much killed everyone that was in that set of, you know, people that were trying to, the resistance, so to speak. So, you know, he wanted to keep him alive, and the doctor was like, absolutely not. And he just, I guess, ethically euthanized him. I feel weird saying that in 2021, but we're just going to go with that. So anyway, as far as, you know, some of the themes towards the end of the movie, it looks like Ophelia, she had to accept her own suffering at the cost of protecting her little brother. Her little brother was also, you know, responsible for the demise of her mother. Not necessarily it was his fault, but, you know, just carrying him into the world. Again, the captain obviously used her mother as a vessel to be able to carry this child. And so, you know, it was really important to him. Like the captain kept talking about the watch and about knowing the time of his father's death. I'm not sure what the significance of that was to him, but he wanted his son to know the same thing when it was time for him to go, or time for him to die. He thought it was important for his son to know the same thing. And I found that interesting because, you know, there was one part of the movie, and we can dig into some of the scripting and acting journey in just a moment. But he said, this is the only decent way to die, talking to one of the characters when they were in the middle of the war. And so, you know, that's the way his father died. Essentially, that's the way that he died. And he wanted that to live on with his son, because he was just so confident that he was having a son. And, you know, we got to see that he was deprived of that at the end, or hopefully that generational curse was broken. But I just found out to be interesting is that, you know, he was so caught up on war that he was willing to, you know, sacrifice everything, including his life, to be able to just uphold that fascism that we saw. So, as far as some of the other aspects of the scripting and acting, we can sort of dig into that. The captain did a good job in his role, because obviously he kind of pissed everyone off. So we have to remember that with actors. It's hard to remember that sometimes with actors, especially when they make you angry. So it's like, oh, okay, I guess you did do a good job. You successfully made me mad. That was your goal. But what other aspects did you pull out of the script and acting journey?
I mainly focus on the script, because with fantasy worlds, it's kind of there, like it's kind of here and go sometimes, depending on like what aspect of the world that they're talking about. So for me, I mainly just focus on the script as far as it goes with the whole movie and focusing on the entire movie. But for some aspects of the acting, I want to focus on Ophelia, the mother, and Mercedes. One, with Mercedes, I felt like her character was true to self regarding the time that the movie was set in. You don't see a lot of women talking back to men during this time, especially in the European countries, because they kind of, especially for her to have this job, it's kind of like she needed this job, as well as she needed to satisfy whoever or whatever she needed to do in order to keep that job. So it was kind of like that was an okay portrayal of her character. When it comes to the mom, I felt I kind of had a little difficulty kind of keeping up with the mom, just as far, I mean, she was sick most of the time in the movie. So it was kind of hard to, she did a great job playing sick, but it was kind of hard to like, I guess, distinguish her character from the others, like what makes her so different from this character. But as far as like just her character and playing a motherly role, she very much did a good job on that. And I kind of related to her in a bit, because she kind of reminded me of my mom. She would do anything that she could to make sure that I'm okay and make sure that her family is taken care of in the best way possible. Now, one thing that my mom wouldn't do is be obedient to someone who only saw her as a vessel, which was kind of why I had so much trouble following her, because it was hard for me just as a woman in 2021 to follow someone that's just basically complying to anything that this man is saying. And that's
And it
where
ended up, that's a good point. It ended up being to her detriment. I think about the one scene where she had sent her to bed without dinner because something happened between Ophelia and the captain. I think she had betrayed him or something at the table, and she sent her to bed without dinner. Then that's when Ophelia was tasked to go on her second journey, which was to go down to the Pale Man, to go see Pale Man, and he had this big feast in front. She was told, don't eat anything off the table. And I don't know if it was just Ophelia being disobedient, if it was curious, or if it was the fact that her mom sent her without dinner, and that ultimately led to the demise of that situation, right? That could have went very badly. And perhaps if she just had something to eat for dinner, she wouldn't have taken a piece of fruit off that table. I don't know if that sort of, if that spoke to you the same way or not. I just found it ironic.
It did to me. That was one of the scenes that kind of stood out to me regarding like obedience as the theme, because like Ophelia, you see she's very obedient with the creatures that are in her like fantasy world, but also with her mom. So you see she's reliably obedient, except for with the stepfather, because he doesn't act like a father, which is very understanding. So with that, her character is very, I guess, obedient in a way that she needs to survive. Her obedience is what's helping her survive in this time, especially in wartime. That's what's helping her and her mom stay alive and things like that. So, because I guarantee you, if Ophelia, if it wasn't for her mom being pregnant with the captain's son, I guarantee you she probably would have done something to upset him to where he might have wanted to, I guess, get rid of them in a sense. So, but going back to Ophelia's character, what's very interesting about this script is the way that it's surrounded around innocence, obedience, and this kind of relating to fairy tales. So when we first meet Ophelia, we see that she's this very innocent, sweet girl who's into fairy tales. And with that, it's kind of like, okay, we kind of foreshadow into what we're going to see later into the movie, but it takes a turn of events when we actually get to the fairy tale aspect of the movie, because one, we don't know if this is her fantasy world or she's just making this up in her own head. And also because it's so gory and gothic, and it doesn't match up to what she's been reading about and what she's been reading these stories to her brother who's in her mom's stomach. And it's very different than what we're expecting. So it's kind of like a turn of events as far as the script itself.
Yeah.
So in regards, I'm sorry.
No, go for it, Kareem.
So in regards to like the dark, gory, and brutal nature of this fairy tale, I think Guillermo, I hope I'm not mispronouncing that.
Guillermo de Toro.
Sorry?
I think it's Guillermo de Toro.
Yeah. I think what he's trying to do is actually make a callback to older fairy tales. So I know a lot of us, when we think of fairy tales, we think of like Cinderella, Snow White, Beauty and the Beast, and like the Disney versions of them. Like those are the versions that we all grew up on. But I think what a lot of people may not know is that these are kind of retellings of the originals, like story of like Cinderella, Beauty and the Beast, Snow White, and the original stories are a lot more graphic and dark. And I think that's actually something that's trying to be said here, is how fairy tales have actually been used to kind of confront dark themes to children, instead of like now when they're kind of like cleaner, for lack of a better words.
That's a really good point, and that sort of leads us into digging into the aspect of the fairy tale, right? Because this was a fairy tale. It had very adult themes. I certainly wouldn't show it to my child. I don't think too many people would want a child to be involved in that. But I think it was edited very nicely. There were some scenes too where the camera work kind of stuck out to us, as far as again, the scene with the pale man, that was done really well. It created a lot of tension when it was time for her to be able to try to get away from him. And I know Devan did some research on Guillermo del Toro when it comes down to the types of movies that he does, to be able to sort of give us those feelings. So what are your thoughts around that?
So Guillermo del Toro's like whole, kind of his interests are in horror and fantasy worlds. He does a lot of work. Most of his work is kind of like gory things like that, like, The Devil's Backbone, comic book adaptations like Blade 2 and Hellboy, video games such as, PT, which was kind of like a spinoff of like a Silent Hill. And so pretty much Guillermo del Toro's whole work or body of work really centers around, fear and gory things. So in terms of like the cinematography and things like that, the cameraman, Navarro, he did a lot of work just doing things with different lightings. So his work with on the movie itself, there was a lot of times where it was dark in the movies, but it wasn't actually dark when they were filming, because of the way that they would have to have shot it with like artificial lights and things wouldn't have been compelling to the scene. So they set a lot of things with during the day, even when it was like a nighttime scene. And then they just created certain shadows and used certain lenses and cameras, such as like the Vision 2250 and the AR. There's a lot of camera work that was put into this to make it able to shoot without it having to be in the dark and artificially lit. And so that's kind of his ideas really center around making things that are comforting fearful. So you are supposed to want to be, Ophelia's friend and things like that, and really root for her, but you're also kind of seeing her in these situations that you're like, why is a child like, so comfortable with these things? She doesn't freak out when she sees the, the initial bug fairy that, most little girls would probably freak out at. Or, when she meets Fawn for the first time, she's interested. And I think that kind of speaks to the level of, fantasy that she lives in, whether or not it's real or not. She is just comfortable. And I think a lot of that had to do with like the lighting and the background of the environment.
Good point. Really good point. Yeah, that Guillermo del Toro, he's an interesting gentleman. So, we've talked about the camera work, we've talked about the scripting, with the music. There were some aspects that Kareem is ready to share with us. So Kareem, I'll give the floor to you.
Okay, so like a lot of this movie's kind of built on contradictions, if you will. Guillermo del Toro uses like a lot of contradicting things, yet it makes sense. And the music is actually no different. So the music actually has like a really childlike quality to it. It's almost like something you would like. A lot of the music comes like straight out of lullabies, and it's even like one of the sound titles called Pan's Labyrinth Lullaby. And I think again, at times just goes to show like this overall like child, it kind of plays with this whole like fairy tale fantasy, childlike innocence that this movie is really kind of all about in the long run.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, it still was a fairy tale. So we have to consider that aspect. So we've kind of touched on it a bit as a group. What do you all think? So at the end of the movie, Captain Vidal came out, this is after Mercedes had stabbed him, and he was sort of in a very compromised state. And so he came out and saw Ophelia. This is when Ophelia was talking to the fawn, but he could not see the fawn. And so is this, or was this a moment where we see that, okay, maybe this movie isn't actually a fantasy. Maybe because Ophelia finds this situation so traumatic that she has created her own fantasy world as sort of a coping mechanism to deal with the trauma of going through war, the loss of her father, the addition of a family member that she really doesn't want. Or is it perhaps that, Captain Vidal was in a state where instead of him hallucinating, he was hallucinating in the reverse. So the fawn actually was there. He was having a conversation with Ophelia and he couldn't see him. But this is an actual fantasy world that Ophelia lives in, not necessarily one that she created. So I'm kind of interested to hear everyone's thoughts on that.
I kind of feel that there's an aspect of both, like of both kind of themes portraying in this whole movie. I do feel like one, this could be something that Ophelia is just tethered to because she's going through war, she's going through the loss of her father, not having this new addition in the family, having the captain who is so rude to her mom and having to take care of her mom. This is like her way of, I guess, relieving stress because she's 11 and she's taking care of a pregnant woman all by herself. And then having to still take care of her and still act as her nurse and do all these things for her mom. But as far as the reality aspect of what she's seen, I kind of feel that it's true to her because the rock that she finds in the middle of the forest when we first see her and she sees this fairy, the fairy, we kind of, there's like a real aspect of it because at first we don't really see that it's a fairy and the mom sees that it's a flying praying mantis. So it kind of makes you wonder and think, well, is this really real or is it pretend or is it in her own world? Because the mom sees it, but she's like, that's not a fairy. That's just a bug almost. And it's kind of like, well, could the mom see anything else? Could anyone else see what Ophelia is seeing? So it kind of makes you question about the movie as far as what's going on. Because from that scene alone, I would think that the fantasy world is real and that anyone can see it. I mean, Mercedes herself was talking about the chamber that Ophelia went down when she first met the fawn, and she was telling the story about Labyrinth, and she was telling all of these things about the fairy tale itself and giving the background about it, since Ophelia didn't know too much about the story herself.
Awesome. Van, how about you?
Uh-oh.
Sorry.
I was of the belief while I was watching it that this was really her world. And I believed it because some of the things that she was interacting with, like when she put the ginger root or whatever, or the magic root underneath the bed with the bowl, like I feel like it would take a lot of suspended disbelief for her to go find that sort of thing and then create this whole world surrounding, if I put this underneath, mommy will get better or whatever. And for a while, her mom is getting better. Mm-hmm. So I think that has to do with, I think it is a real world. I think that, there are the parallels of like the underworld and the real world. And right now there's this Spanish war going on, and it's very easy for her to retreat to, a fantasy world. But for the fantasy world to interact with the real world back, I think that speaks to, this is real for her, and this is real for people who are part of that underworld. It just, most of the people are human beings and not like, the princess of the underworld. So I think that it's a real world. She just escaped, like the beginning of the movie said, she escaped to another world. But this world, ironically, is worse than the one she left.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point, Devan. And that underworld seemed to be a very lovely place where she got to be reconnected with her parents. We're actually going to dig into the mise-en-scene and the costumes as well in just a minute, but I do want to hear Kareem's perspective on whether or not he believes this was a fantasy world or a created world.
Okay. So I'm somewhere in the middle, right? Like I can't decide whether I want to be like in the skeptic camp of it was not real, or I want to be in the believer camp that it is real. And ironically, I think that was the intention of it. I think it was like pretty intentionally vague of whether this is like just something in Ophelia's mind or if it really is real. I don't know. Like this is one of those movies where it's almost like a multiple choice ending. Like you're gonna get what you want to get out of it. If you want to view it as like if you want to view it as like an exploration of one's trauma and coping, then you have to go with the premise that everything we experienced was not real and that it was in Ophelia's head. But if you want to view it as like a fairy tale, then you have to accept the premise that okay, what we are seeing is real. It's just like Devan said, only certain people can really interact with like the magic. It's almost like this is totally off topic, but it's different. Remember, any of you ever saw like the Percy Jackson movies or like read the Percy Jackson books? Okay, so basically in these books, it's almost like only like the children of the gods can like see like the Minotaur monsters and stuff like that. And so it's a very similar situation, similar to that. And I think the narrator themselves even said like in the end, so when Ophelia dies, according to the narrator, like the princess left traces of her existence on Earth, but were only visible to those who knew where to look. And Vidal, as we see, is like this super realist, like fascist kind of individual. So,
wait, I have a question regarding this idea. Could it be that since the captain is all about war and he and his compatriots are all about war, that they don't have time enough to believe it, almost kind of like a Peter Pan situation? So we get the idea that Ophelia is a believer of fairy tales, so she's going to see the fairy tales, she's going to believe in the fairy tales. She reads to her mom, who encourages her to be a believer of the fairy tales, so that could also mean that she's a believer of fairy tales as well. So could it just be that the believers or the people who believe in the fairy tales are the ones who can see these creatures, while the ones who are disbelievers can't?
That if the premise of like that the fairy tale is real, if that's the camp, then one may fall under, then I think that explains it, right? that's the explanation that's going to be given, that only certain people can really access this fairy tale, and it's based on like if they truly believe it. But if you're more in the skeptic camp, if it's all made up, then actually I think you can see how different characters represent different parts of Ophelia's psyche. Like the Pale Man now isn't just like a monster, it's almost in a sense like a representation of Ophelia's belief getting like crushed. It's no coincidence that the Pale Man is the one who eats the fairy, for lack of better words, fairy tale. But here's this creature that eats the fairies.
That's a really good point, Kareem, and I'll touch on this and then make sure that Devan has her time. But the missing eyes sort of kind of plays into the moral blindness, which I thought was interesting. I did a little bit of research, and it had sort of talked about some of the touches with the doctor who wears glasses, so like he's able to see, his eyes are open, as opposed to like the father in the comparisons between the Pale Man. He sort of has like a moral blindness, or he has to be able to use his hands to see. It's not something that's an easy thing for him to be able to do. So as far as the whether or not this is real or not, it sort of leaves it up to you, which is something that I can appreciate by Vidal. By Del Toro. So Devan, any comments on the mise-en-scene or characters? I know this is when I wish you had a little bit more time to be able to dig into, because it's not of this time. It's not like Get Out was, they're just wearing regular old t-shirts and jeans. So
yeah, so the costuming is obviously very close to the time. The war costumes, of the soldiers is reminiscent of the Nazi costumes of Nazi Germany. Everything, even down to their hairstyles, that clean cut, clean shaven, those type of things are still associated with Nazis and, fascist regimes. The clean cutness of the generals or the captain's uniform at all times, appearances are very important to them. They want to be crisp and perfect because they are the complete opposite of the guerrilla warriors, the people who are trying to fight in the resistance. And I think that's very important. And also the clothing and things that Ophelia, her mother, and Mercedes wear, those are all typical of women in the 1940s. And that's because that's kind of when it takes place. Ophelia is supposed to be this clean cut little girl. She has the short haircut that all the girls had. Her mother wears, dresses. You don't see any women wearing pants because that's just not proper of them during that time. And I think that's definitely what the costume designer really wanted to like weigh in on. And in terms of the mise-en-scene, everything around them is war. Those camps and those, the things around them are very realistic. Like if you looked at any wartime documentary, that's exactly what it looks like. It's very true to life. I think that a lot of research was done in order to make it as realistic as possible. Now, when you're talking about, the underworld, the fantasy world, those things, the makeup and everything like that was used was specifically done so that the surroundings are comforting, or like when she's in the room with the Pale Man, the surroundings are comforting. It's very nice. It's very welcoming. The Pale Man is the only thing that kind of stands out. And I think that's because of the amount of time it took to do the makeup and things on the Pale Man and on Fawn. Because Guillermo del Toro doesn't use CGI effects. So all of that is makeup and, set design and work. And I think that's very important. So the use of prosthetics and things like that in this film really make you able to connect, because at a certain point, CGI just doesn't look real anymore. But when you have, someone in makeup and prosthetics, that person can actually be interacted with in the film, making it even more scary. You can see the Pale Man reaching out towards Ophelia towards the end. And that's what makes it so, like heart thumping. You're watching this real thing come after her. And so I think that the mise-en-scene and the costume work were done beautifully to make it so that you are never truly comfortable in the scene, because at one point or another, you're either dealing with the fantasy world that is full of horror, or the real world that is also full of like war and, distraught in this. And it's very true to what it actually would have looked like if this was a real situation.
Good point. Well, I want to leave this or end this off by saying, they talked about Ophelia dying because she didn't spill the blood of an innocent, but she was totally innocent. She didn't deserve that. But then if she did get to rule in her underworld, then maybe she did. So interesting ending there. But great job, everyone, on your analysis.